On November 1st, 1396, St. Paul's Cathedral in London was filled with hundreds of candles, and the sound of the organ echoed through the naves as a royal procession made its way down the central aisle. This was the wedding of 6-year-old Isabelle of France, Europe's youngest princess, to Richard II, the 29-year-old King of England. Dressed in golden silks, the little girl struggled to bear the weight of her crown as she walked towards the altar. In a few minutes, she would be declared Queen of England, sealing a political alliance that would change the destiny of two nations. The text asks how such a young child could become the centerpiece of medieval diplomacy at its most brutal. To understand Isabelle's tragic fate, we must go back to 14th century France, a kingdom living under the shadow of royal madness. Isabelle was born on November 9th, 1389, at the Louvre Palace, the daughter of Charles VI of France and Isabelle of Bavaria. She was the royal couple's fourth daughter, a princess born in dark times that would mark her entire existence. Her father, Charles VI, was known as Charles the Mad because of episodes of insanity that had afflicted him since he was 24. During his crises, the king would not recognize his wife or children, believed he was made of glass and would shatter if anyone touched him, or would flee through the palace corridors screaming that invisible enemies were pursuing him. France was plunged into chaos, governed by regents who fought for power while the true king remained imprisoned in his own mind. Isabelle's mother, Isabeau of Bavaria, was also a controversial figure. She was ambitious and unscrupulous, and she took advantage of her husband's illness to accumulate power and wealth. Chroniclers of the time described her as a dissolute woman who kept lovers while neglecting her children. For Isabeau, her daughters were valuable commodities in the European political game, destined to seal alliances through arranged marriages. Little Isabelle grew up in this toxic environment, surrounded by palace intrigues and political instability. France was torn apart by the 100 Years' War against England, conflicts between the Armagnacs and Burgundians, and the consequences of royal madness. For a sensitive child, witnessing her father's crises and her mother's calculating coldness created traumas that would accompany her throughout her life. In 1396, when Isabelle was only 6 years old, a diplomatic opportunity arose that would change her destiny forever. Richard II of England, after years of war against France, sought peace to consolidate his internal power. He had lost his first wife, Anne of Bohemia, and needed a new matrimonial alliance that would bring political and financial stability. The French counselors, led by the Duke of Berry, saw a golden opportunity in the English request. They proposed the marriage between Isabelle and Richard, offering a gigantic dowry of £800,000 and a 28-year truce. For France, which was bankrupted by war, it was an irresistible opportunity to buy peace with the sacrifice of a child. The negotiations lasted for months and were conducted with the coldness of commercial transactions. French and English ambassadors discussed the terms as if Isabelle were cattle being sold at market. Her age, considered extremely young even by medieval standards, was a subject of debate. Some English counselors argued it would be better to wait until she turned 12, an age considered suitable for consummating matrimony. However, Richard II was desperate. He faced internal rebellions, devastating financial problems, and the constant threat of deposition. French money and external peace were more important than considerations about the bride's age. In October 1396, the terms were finally settled. Isabelle of France would be delivered to England as a political gift, a child sacrificed on the altar of royal diplomacy. Isabelle's farewell from her French family was a spectacle carefully orchestrated to impress the English ambassadors. At the Louvre Palace, Charles VI, in one of his moments of lucidity, blessed his little daughter with tears in his eyes. Isabeau of Bavaria, on the other hand, demonstrated her habitual coldness, treating the separation as a successful business deal. Little Isabelle did not fully understand what was happening. For her, the journey to England was an adventure, perhaps temporary. She took with her only a few toys, her favorite dolls, and a small pet dog that had kept her company at the Louvre. The French retinue that accompanied her included hundreds of nobles, servants, and a special guard to protect the treasure being transported. The journey from Calais to London lasted several weeks and was marked by grandiose ceremonies in each English city they crossed. Local authorities competed to offer the most sumptuous receptions to the future queen, but Isabelle, exhausted and intimidated by the excessive pomp, frequently cried and asked to go home. In London, Richard II prepared a wedding that would rival any royal ceremony of the era. St. Paul's Cathedral was decorated with French and English fabrics intertwined, symbolizing the union of the two kingdoms. Thousands of candles imported from France illuminated the environment, while choirs sang in Latin and French. It was a spectacle designed not only to impress subjects, but also to demonstrate to the world that England had achieved peace through diplomacy. Richard II, at 29, was one of the most refined men in Europe, a lover of arts and literature. He had deeply loved his first wife, and the prospect of marrying a child visibly embarrassed him. However, political necessities superseded any personal consideration. During the ceremony, Isabelle remained silent, clearly intimidated by the grandeur of the event. The Archbishop of Canterbury had to kneel to place the ring on her tiny finger while she looked around, seeking familiar faces that were no longer there. When declared Queen of England, she showed no joy, only confusion and growing fear. Isabelle's life at the English court was initially protected by the circumstances of her age. To his credit, Richard II treated her more like a daughter than a wife. He provided her with French tutors, allowed her to maintain her native customs, and ensured she was raised with royal dignity. Isabelle received her own apartments at Westminster Palace, a manor house, and servants devoted exclusively to her well-being. But the child queen's happiness was brutally interrupted in September 1399. Richard II, facing a rebellion led by Henry Bolingbroke, was deposed and subsequently murdered at Pontefract Castle. As Isabelle, at 10 years old, became a widow without ever having been truly a wife. Richard's death created a political dilemma for the English. Isabelle was a legitimate queen, but her marriage had never been consummated and she had no heirs. Worse still, the £800,000 dowry had already been spent, and returning her to France would mean also returning money that no longer existed. Henry IV, the new English king, initially tried to keep Isabelle as a golden prisoner, hoping to use her in future negotiations with France. The young widow was kept in comfortable captivity at Havering Castle, where she spent 3 years fighting for her own freedom. Her desperate letters to French relatives reveal a girl who had matured prematurely through suffering. One of her letters to her father said, "I write to you in tears, for I am kept here like a prisoner, far from all I love, without hope of return." Her pleas finally touched Charles VI's heart, who, in one of his moments of lucidity, categorically demanded his daughter's return. In 1401, after long diplomatic negotiations, Isabelle finally returned to France. But the girl who had left Paris at 6 had transformed into a 12-year-old prematurely aged by traumatic experiences. The return to the Louvre did not bring the expected happiness. France continued to be plunged in chaos, and her family received her more as a political inconvenience than as a beloved daughter. Isabelle's tragedy, however, was far from over. In 1405, at 16, she was again used as political currency when her mother arranged her second marriage to Charles of Orléans, a young French poet and nobleman. This time, however, Isabelle achieved something that had been denied her in childhood, a marriage based on mutual affection. Charles of Orléans was sensitive, intellectual, and genuinely in love with Isabelle. The couple found happiness in arts, poetry, and a love that flourished despite the political circumstances of their union. Isabelle finally experienced what it was to be loved for herself, not for her value as a negotiating piece. But happiness was short-lived. In 1407, Charles was captured by the English at the Battle of Agincourt and spent 25 years as a prisoner in England. Isabelle, again a widow in practice, returned to solitude and dependence on the French royal family. life had stolen from her twice the possibility of loving and being loved. During the years that followed, Isabelle lived discreetly at the French court, dedicating herself to charity and the arts. Her experience as England's child queen had given her a unique perspective on politics and diplomacy, knowledge she used discreetly to advise other members of the royal family. In 1409, Isabelle gave birth to her only daughter, Joan of Orleans, a child who would grow up without knowing her father. Motherhood brought her some consolation, but also the bitter irony of knowing that her own daughter would probably face the same destiny, being used as a political instrument in arranged marriages. Isabelle of France died in 1409 at 20 years old from postpartum complications. Her life had been entirely dominated by others' political needs. She was sacrificed at 6 in a diplomatic marriage, widowed at 10, imprisoned at 12, married again at 16 for political convenience, and a practical widow at 18 when her second husband was captured. Her death passed almost unnoticed by the chroniclers of the time, a striking contrast to the pomp that had surrounded her first wedding. Isabelle of France had fulfilled her role as a political piece, generating an heir and sealing alliances, but never had the opportunity to live for herself. Isabelle's story raises profound questions about the role of women in medieval politics and the human price of royal diplomacy. Her experience illustrates how children, especially girls of nobility, were treated as transferable properties between kingdoms, their lives entirely subordinated to the political interests of their parents and husbands. More than 600 years later, Isabelle of France's tragedy continues to resonate as a somber reminder of the horrors of child marriage and the objectification of children for political purposes. Her story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about how entire societies can normalize the sacrifice of innocence in the name of greater interests. The child princess who was delivered as a political gift never truly had a childhood. From age 6, she carried state responsibilities that should have belonged to adults. Her life was a continuous sacrifice to the gods of medieval politics, a price paid for temporary peace between enemy nations. Isabelle of France remains an eternal symbol of childhood vulnerability before uncontrolled political power. Her memory reminds us that behind each diplomatic treaty, each royal alliance, and each political marriage in history, there frequently existed children whose lives were destroyed to satisfy the powerful's ambitions. The girl who became queen at 6 paid the supreme price for peace between France and England, her own happiness and ultimately her life.